It's easy to take soils for granted. We walk on them, sit on them, kick them, throw them, dig them, do all sorts of things to them. And yet, soils are one of the most important controls on how ecosystems function. And in the global food system, they play a critical role in global food and agricultural activities. Soils are also heavily impacted by human activities. So in this video, we'll look at what soils are, how they're described and how they vary around the world, and then we'll wrap up by looking at a little bit at how they're threatened by human activity and overuse. Here's what you should be able to do by the end of this video. First, you should be able to describe why soils are important to ecosystems, both natural and agricultural systems. You should explain, at least in a basic way, about how soils are described and how this relates to the role that they play in ecosystems. And lastly, you should be able to review some of the major threats to soils and how these threats could impact broader environmental issues. Let's start with what soils actually are. And this definition is a bit of a mouthful, but it's worth working through. This is a definition that comes from the Soil Science Society of America. And it says it's a couple different options. The first one is soils are the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of land plants. Or two, the unconsolidated mineral organic matter on the surface of the earth that has been subjected to and shows the effects of genetic and environmental factors of climate, including water and temperature effects, and macro and microorganisms conditioned by relief, acting on parent material over a period of time. A product soils differs from the material from which it's derived in many physical, chemical, biological, morphological properties and characteristics. All right, that second one's a mouthful. First part, soils are a mix of mineral and organic matter that are teeming with living organisms, both microbial and some more macro organisms. The second point here is that soils change over time, and they change as a function of climate. As they weather and change, they change as they're affected by organisms, both micro and macroorganisms, and they're affected by things like relief, topographic relief, erosion, deposition, rivers. All of these sorts of things affect the way that soils are structured, how they're chemically oriented, and how they change over time. The picture on the left is actually of state soils, which you probably didn't know existed if you hadn't paid attention to this before. The point of the picture is that if you look at Alabama, Nebraska, Alaska, Nevada, Arizona, and New Hampshire, soils are really different. They're different in appearance. These are very different in chemical characteristics, and all of that affects the way that soils can be used, especially for agriculture. So those are some of the things we want to look at. One key thing to understand about soils is that they really do provide the structure and the physical setting for plant growth. You can grow plants in water, that would be aquaponics, but most plants on the planet grow in soils. And that's a physical setting for where the roots go down and where nutrients and water are acquired by plants. In fact, almost all the nutrients for plant growth in natural ecosystems come from the soil. It comes directly, in the case of phosphorus and the base cations, such as magnesium, potassium, calcium, from rock weathering, breakdown of rock over time, and also nitrogen from microbial processing that happens in the surface of the soils. We'll talk more about those processes in a different video. But the key point is that without soil, you don't get plants. The photo here is an agricultural field in Tanzania, and you can see that the soils are being prepped for planting of maize on this particular site. And the hope is that these soils will provide the water storage and then also the nutrients that maize needs to grow through the next growing season. Okay, so soils are really, really important to hydrology. Soils hold and release water over time, and without that, plants would not survive. There are a couple of things I want to show you actually in a few videos I made in my backyard, but here's 2 points before we look at those. First, the rate at which water moves into a soil is called the infiltration rate, and that varies a lot with the structure of the soil. Something you've probably noticed actually, even if you didn't know it. We'll talk about that in a second. Secondly, the rate at which water evaporates out of soils really varies with the structure, the way that the soil is put together, something we'll talk about in a couple slides. And this helps maintain the water between seasons or rainfall events so plants can keep growing. So let's look at 3 examples of different soils. All right, so here's soil example number 1. This is a sandy kind of gravel mixture from my backyard. I'm going to put it up on this post. I'm going to add some water and let's see what happens. Here comes the water. You can see it starts moving down through the soil, and there's a hole in the bottom of this little jug which will let the water out. You'll see it a second when I lift it up. See, all that water moved straight into the soil. That's the infiltration rate I was talking about. And there it comes out the bottom, moving very, very quickly because this soil is a fairly coarse soil. It's mostly sand and larger particles. We'll talk about that in a second. Here comes soil number 2. All right, this one's very organic rich. This is actually what I grow my tomatoes in. So very little mineral material and mostly just organic matter. We add the water. It's moving down, but a little slower than the last one. See, it's barely reached the bottom right now. Adding a little bit more water. You can see it's pooling up there on the top now. Take a look. It's dripping through, but not as fast as the last one. And when we look at the top of here, you can see there's still water pooled up in the top. It's just not moving in as fast. It's still a lower infiltration rate than the last soil we looked at. Lastly, here comes soil number 3. This is actually standard boulder soil, something you might dig up on the ground. So here comes the water. It moves down reasonably quickly, but look at all that water pooling up on top. I take a look, and that water's not moving in very fast. It actually spills out of the top. Very slow infiltration rate, and it's not dripping as much. This soil has much smaller particles, and it doesn't let the water actually enter as fast as the other ones. Still pooled on top after all that. The reason why those 3 soils had different infiltration rates is really because of their structure. And structure is influenced by several different things, but a key component is something called texture. Texture is the ratio of sand to silt to clay in a soil. Sand are the biggest particles, they're 50 to 2,000 microns. Silts are the next size down, they're 2 to 50 microns, and clays are 2 microns and lowest and below. These types of materials really affect how water moves. If you imagine pouring water onto a sandcastle on the beach, the water goes straight through the sand and doesn't stay. Imagine pouring water on a clay soil that's like sticking to your feet, and the water pools on top, it won't move into the soil, you get a completely different effect. This matters in 2 ways. So one, from a hydrologic perspective, soils that let water in quickly but don't let water out very quickly are better at holding water. And that's the case for what are called loams, which are shown in this texture triangle from the USDA. It's a specific mix of sand, silt, and clay that's just right for agricultural activity. Many of the world's most productive agricultural soils are in this loam category. Those types of soils also tend to store more carbon and nutrients than other types of soils, which again helps boost productivity in those sites. So soils matter a lot, both for hydrology and for nutrient storage, and that then influences the types of plants that can grow there. Now let's talk a little bit about how we describe soils. And soils have a lot more structure vertically than you might think about if you have never thought about this before. Soils are actually described by these vertical zones, and there are 3 that are worth talking about. The top layer, which is the most organic rich, usually the most darkly stained part of the soil, is called the O horizon. This is the organic rich surface layer. It's more similar in structure to plant material, but a little bit more decomposed than the litter that's lying on top. The next layer down is the A horizon. This is a surface soil. This is a mix of minerals and decomposed organic matter. The A horizon and the O horizon are the 2 layers that are really critical to nutrient supply to growing plants. The layer below that's called the B horizon. It's a subsoil, and structurally it's quite similar to the bedrock, but is more weathered and broken down than the actual rock structure is. So there's an idealized diagram on the left. You can see where the rooting occurs. That goes OA and B horizons. C is the actual kind of rock layer. And then there's a Iowa state soil, which I pulled out because Iowa has really phenomenal soils for plant growth and agriculture. That's a loam soil right there. The other key point about soils is that they're not the same everywhere. In fact, they vary in major ways around the world. So soils actually have different names, and the names for us aren't really that important. But let me just give you 2 examples. The soils that are in the far north in northern Alaska and parts of Siberia are called gelisols. They're northern latitudes. They're very, very organic rich. This is where you'd find permafrost soils located. In contrast, if you go down to the Brazilian Amazon or parts of the Congo Basin, you'll find oxasols. These are very, very old soils. They're incredibly chemically weathered. They're usually orange in color because of high iron content, and they have really low nutrient content. Contrast that to, say, the soils that are found in the Midwestern U.S. are called mollisols, pretty rich in organic matter. They are those loam-type soils that we talked about before, really good for agriculture. So these types of variations, which occur because long histories of exposure to different climates and topographic relief and erosion and all these other processes, they lead to soils that have distinct properties. And the distinct properties then affect how you manage the soils for agriculture or how you understand them for natural ecosystems. The last slide is about risks to soils. And the key point here is that you have to take care of soils. These are very fragile parts of ecosystems. They have a physical structure with those layers that can be disturbed. They have chemical structures that can be affected by things like fertilization. If you take away the vegetation, they can erode by wind or water. If you drive heavy mechanized equipment over them, they can be compacted and lose their ability to hold air or hold water. If you irrigate too much, you can salinize the soil or increase the salt content, and you can create acidified soils if you are not careful about how you use fertilizers. And the long story short is that the soils around the world are really threatened for poor management. The good part is that there are a lot of efforts right now to try to reverse degradation and create more fertile, stable, and sustainable soils in many places. And even organic agriculture actually has components which help in the restoration of soils. So there's a lot more to talk about there, but it's just important right now to understand this is one of the key ways that soils interact with a lot of other global issues that affect the sustainability of our ecosystems and our agricultural systems. So to wrap up some of the things we've covered in this video, soils are really important to many of the hydrologic and biogeochemical aspects that we worry about in ecosystems, both natural and agricultural systems. We describe soils through their vertical layers, which are called horizons, and also by their chemical and physical properties, which vary spatially as a result of their age, climate, and other factors. And these, in fact, are mapped globally in the way that we saw in one of the earlier slides. Lastly, there is global overuse of soils, and that places soils and their associated ecosystems at risk globally. The major causes of degradation globally are erosion, compaction, salinization, and acidification, but there are a lot of things that really do affect how soils function. And a last little note here, if you're interested in learning more about soils around you, have a look at www.landpotential.org. This is a mobile app that we develop in our Sustainability Innovation Lab at Colorado, Silk. And you can download the Land PKS mobile application for iOS or Android, and you can do a lot of stuff in there to look at and understand the soils that are around you.